Let's go to the next big thing in national politics, and that will be Peter Dutton's budget and reply speech, which will bring you live on Sky News tonight at 7:30pm. I'm joined now in the studio by Liberal MP Zoe McKenzie. Good to talk to you, Zoe. Tell us about this budget and reply speech. We're expecting a lot on immigration, energy and also housing.
That's certainly been the discussion today, but I suspect it will be much like his last two budgets in reply, both in October 22 and last May, focusing primarily on the cost of living, but also leaning in to offer help to the government in things like a sustainable NDIS going forward. And you might recall that in his very first budget in reply speech, he called for us to solve the scourge of domestic violence within a generation. He has been focused on these issues from the beginning and making commitments towards those and other things in his budgets in reply, and I suspect tonight will be no different. He was calling for energy cost relief in the last ones, and he will back that in further with cost of living relief focus tonight.
When you talk about cost of living, though, you've got to talk about immigration and the housing crisis because they're all intertwined. Let's have a look at some of what transpired in question time today.
The Albanese government's first budget forecast net overseas migration of 235,000 people in 22-23. In this week's budget, it was revealed that 22-23 net overseas migration was 528,000. Labor forecast missed the mark by 293,000. How can the Australian people believe any forecast this government makes on net overseas migration?
I thank the member for his question because the system that we inherited was broken. We say that is the case. That's why we're setting about fixing it.
It's all the coalition's fault. Now, that's a pretty spirited attack in question time today. Well, I'm presuming from that the coalition will certainly be promising to drastically lower our immigration rate. Andrew Clennell broke the news on Sky today, suggesting that the rate could go down to 160,000 people per annum.
So interestingly, the historical level's around 200,000, sometimes a bit more. You might remember the country had a really important conversation a few years ago about Kevin Rudd's Big Australia. Big Australia was consistent with 300,000 a year. Last year, over 500,000. The forecast for the next 5, 1.67 million. At the same time as cutting hundreds of millions of dollars out of the infrastructure budget. I lost 300 million alone in road and rail at last year's infrastructure review. So if you're going to bring people in numbers like that, you have got to have done the work in terms of infrastructure, none of which has been done. And in fact, we're going backwards in some parts of the country in terms of infrastructure investment now. So we're nowhere near prepared for those numbers. It's why you see housing up by 12%, rents up by 12%. And frankly, I think that's a modest assessment. Certainly in my electorate, they're up by a whole lot more than 12%, particularly with all the land taxes and changes that you've seen imposed by the Victorian state government as well. The prices are going through the roof for housing, for food, for electricity. So the country's not ready for numbers like that. So it's sensible to have a good review of those numbers and to propose something that we can actually afford.
Well, Labor can hardly disagree, of course, because they're promising to halve the immigration intake. They just can't actually match their actions to their promises, as in so many areas.
Right.
But how do you cut immigration so steeply without adding to our skills shortage?
Therein lies the problem as well, right? So particularly in my part of the world, there are great skill shortages. And when I spoke to the immigration minister about that about 18 months ago, he said, Zoe, I'm going to fix it. We're going to let the international students back in. And I said, that's great, but I don't have a university campus, so that's not going to help me on the Mornington Peninsula, where 8 million people go for holidays, and we desperately need staff in retail, hospitality, tourism, but equally health and education, all the other things as well. So we do need people. We need skilled people in particular, but we need to look at the housing at the same time, because at the moment we just don't have enough affordable housing.
And I expect on housing
workers.
more use of our own superannuation savings to help us get into the housing market.
I suspect that one will be reiterated again, as it was, I think, in the first budget in reply in October 22. Peter did stand behind that policy that had been taken to the previous election, as he did things like people who are on welfare, pensioners, should be able to work more, earn more. That's something I desperately need on the peninsula. It's the 5th oldest electorate in the country, and people want to work. They particularly want to work for their sons and daughters and the businesses they're running. And it would be great if they could do that without being penalised.
Look forward to hearing more about it at 7:30 tonight. Thanks for joining us, Zoe. Zoe McKenzie there, Liberal MP up from Melbourne. That's 7:30 tonight is Peter Dutton's budget in reply address.